So this is one of the common question we get from a lot of our customers. So I think before you start creating subnets, before you start like allocating IP addresses, the first thing you need to think about like what are the different IP addresses I need to use, I need for my GKE cluster. For example, if you look into GKE cluster, so if you are creating a private clusters, yes, you need like a /28 range for your control plane, whether it's a VPC peering based control plane or private service connect based control plane. It's good to have a /28 range, not overlapping with other subnets so that it can be unique. And then the primary one called the node subnet. This is your primary subnet where your work nodes will be running. So when you're planning for that one, so you need to think about the current cluster size you're planning. I mean, the number of nodes you're planning to create now. You also need to think about the future scaling. Okay, how my workload is going to scale in 6 months time, in 12 months time, in a longer time. How many worker nodes I will have in my clusters, and then you need to create the subnet range for that one. We have seen customers just create /16 range for the node subnet, and then they never use it. So when you're creating the primary subnet for nodes, yes, think about your future scaling and then allocate enough IP addresses for the node one. Sometimes we see like customers creating the TCP load balancer, which takes IP addresses from the node subnet. Okay, yeah, you need to think about that one as well. On the private service connect control plane clusters, it takes a /28 range if you don't provide your own /28 range. So you should think about all this one before you start allocating the subnet for nodes. And then there are two alias ranges, one for the pod IP and another one for the service IP. As mentioned in the beginning, for the service IP, currently, if you don't specify a service IP, Google automatically allocates a /20 range for service IP range, whether it's a standard cluster or autopilot cluster. As I said, like the service IP ranges are reachable only within the cluster, so you can use the same range. Then it's not mandatory that you need to assign a range for service IP, but if you want to keep it unique, yeah, you can assign a secondary range for the service IP. The pod IP and the other thing, yes, you need to allocate a large pod IP range, and you need to think about like how many pods I'm going to run on my cluster, and then you need to assign a specific range for the pod IP. So because most of the time we see issues on the pod IP range because the customer says like, okay, I have enough IP ranges on my node, but my scaling is affected. My cluster is not scaling. Why? Mostly it's happened because of the pods per node setting. Most of the customers are not aware of it. So when they create the worker node pool, they create the node pool with the standard nodes per node setting, which is 110 by default. How GKE allocates IP range, just like GKE actually allocates double the IP range for each node. If you are creating a node pool with 110 as the maximum pods per node setting, GKE actually allocates 256 IP addresses to the particular node. So if you are not having enough pod IP address range, and then your node scaling is affected, even though you have enough number of IP addresses available for your node subnet, but you don't have enough number of IP addresses available in your pod IP range, so scaling is affected. So most of the time, we don't see why you need 110 pods per node, because we hardly see customers running like 50 pods per node. So it's good to start with like minimum number of IP addresses. For example, 64. If you look into the autopilot allocates like 32 pods per node configuration. That's the default one. You can change it. Yes, you can use that one as well, or you can just plan how many pods I'm going to run on my node, and then you can adjust it. So you need to put this pods per node configuration before you create the node pool, because once you create the node pool, you can't change it. Of course, you can delete and recreate the node pool with the newer settings. So the pods per node setting is critical when it comes to managing IP addresses. Also, okay, I'm now running out of my pod IP addresses. So what can I do? So that's why that's something called discontinuous multi-pod classless inter-domain routing. So that means like you can add a secondary range now. You can add an additional pod IP range, and then you can use that range in your new node pool. Of course, you can't use that one in the existing node pool. You can assign a new range for your pod IP, and then you can use it. So that's why I mentioned like service IPs are like non-changeable. So once you create it, once you allocate it, you can't change it. But pod, Google GKE now allows you to add an additional range, which you can use. The other thing is like, okay, I don't have any RFC 1918 IP addresses. What can I do? You can use non-RFC 1918 IP addresses for pods. It's something called like privately used public addresses. You can use a public IP range for your pod as well. and then you can use the IP masquerade agent to actually convert your pod IP into your node IP before it leaves the cluster. So yeah, there are like multiple options you can use to effectively manage your pod range. And also, like when you, most of the time we see like customer creates GKE clusters in the default subnet. Most of the time it works because it's going to get started, but without any IP addresses planning, but we don't recommend it. Always like start with the custom subnet mode so that you can customize the IP addresses based on your need. Also, we also recommend create a load balancer subnet. As I said, like if you don't use a load balancer subnet, if you are creating like TCP or network load balancer, GKE, the GCP load balancing take away one IP addresses from the node subnet. So it's good to like have a dedicated load balancer subnet if you are planning to create a large number of TCP load balancer. It's good to have a dedicated load balancer subnet. You can also use the same subnet with multiple GKE clusters if needed. Also, this is something we don't recommend. It's now possible for you to share the same network with multiple GKE clusters. Previously, it was not possible. You can now use the same subnet with multiple GKE clusters, which we don't recommend. But if you want to like keep the routing simple, if you want to keep the communication between clusters simple, then you can use it. Something we don't recommend. Yeah.